I am a 19-year-old female, and at the time that all of this happened to me, I was 17. So, just to give some long and necessary background, I was and still am dating a guy named Kyle. We shared a small group of friends, and we were all pretty close to each other. We did almost everything together, especially when it involved smoking weed and doing other harder substances. They were pretty chill and trustworthy friends, or so I thought. Anyways, one day, 2 weeks before my junior year started, I was hanging out with the group at one of their houses, and I just so happened to be asleep after a while of being there. I woke up probably 5 minutes later to one of my friends touching my inner thigh. Just a note, I was the only female in the group, and my boyfriend wasn't there when this occurred. He was at a show, so he couldn't have been there even if he wanted to. When the friend touching me noticed I woke up, he immediately stopped and I ran into the bathroom crying. I've been raped and sexually assaulted before, so just going through it again isn't the greatest feeling. A few minutes passed by and I left the bathroom. I pulled one of my friends aside and told him what happened, and his response shocked me. He said he saw what happened, but he didn't stop him. I don't know why he didn't, and I guess I'll never know. That same friend told me not to tell Kyle because he didn't want any friendships ruined. Well, I obviously told my boyfriend after the show, and he was understandably pissed off. We've come to the agreement that we will no longer be friends with him anymore. A few days went by still avoiding the group, and we would receive a lot of messages from them, but they were shocking and hurtful messages saying I'm being overdramatic and it's my fault. Well, to be honest, I was pretty destroyed reading all those messages coming from those so-called friends, but for some reason, we all became friends again when school started. I know what you're thinking. Why would we go back to that group of friends? And I guess our only lame excuse is that we hate confrontation and we wanted things to go back to normal. Well, obviously, it wasn't the best idea taking back those friends, especially the one who touched me, because it started to really affect me mentally. I became super depressed and I developed really bad trust issues with everyone, including my boyfriend. Now, fast forward to around February 2018, one night, that's when it happened. I was having trouble sleeping and it was getting late. I also had school the next morning, so I was getting pretty frustrated. Finally, around 1 a.m., I started dozing off. I found myself awake probably about 10 to 15 minutes later. I noticed a tall, dark figure standing across the room in my closet. At first, I thought it was my brother messing with me because he's done stuff like this before, but as I tried to say his name, I just couldn't. That's when I realized I couldn't even move. I was paralyzed. As I'm staring at this figure in my closet, wondering what the F is happening, the figure starts moving closer to me. Then I noticed it kind of looks like it was floating towards me. I could feel myself panicking, but I couldn't move or say anything. When the tall dark figure reached the side of my bed, I kid you not, it bent over and grabbed my nose. Now I couldn't even breathe and I was just staring at this dark figure. Its face was so close to mine, but I couldn't even make out any features. I could feel my heart trying to break out of my chest and my lungs were hurting like hell because I couldn't breathe. I thought I was about to die, but suddenly I quickly sat up, gasping for air, looking around my room for that figure, but it wasn't there. I was so scared I didn't know what just happened. The next morning, when my boyfriend picked me up for school, I told him about the realistic nightmare. He said that's creepy, and that was that. A few weeks later, I brought it up to my brother, and that's when he told me that I actually had sleep paralysis. I had no clue what that was, but after hearing his definition of it and doing some research, I was really freaked out. I read online that stress, anxiety, depression, sleep problems, and some other things can cause sleep paralysis. I realized that everything that happened to me sort of recently played a big part in my sleep paralysis episode that night. I would be lying if I said I didn't have trouble sleeping for a while after that, but I eventually got over it. During the summer of 2003, I moved in with a student from South Africa. We shared a bedroom and I slept on the sofa in the living room sometimes because she always slept with a nightlight on. I just couldn't get myself to sleep with that much light in the room. I also tend to close the bedroom door, but she always leaves it open. Summer classes finished around the end of July and she moved out of the student housing soon after for the rest of the summer. I had the place to myself and moved into her side of the room when she left and started sleeping in the dark with the bedroom door locked as usual. I don't remember the exact date of my first sleep paralysis episode, but it was pretty close after the Northeast blackout in 2003. One of the largest power outages in US history. It affected about 45 million people in several states, including Michigan, and one day I was cleaning and the vacuum cut off. All the electricity in the apartment went off, and I waited a few hours for it to come back on, and it didn't. I would say a few days after this event, I went to sleep one night, and then it happened. I woke up in bed and couldn't move, couldn't speak, and couldn't even recall any language, or my name, or any personal details. I could see the ceiling, the other side of the room where my former bed was, and the bedroom door. However, all of these were engulfed in flames of smokeless, slow-rolling dark blue fire. There were no warm or electric tones in the fire. It looked like freezing cold blue fire that gave off a slight luminous light. I could see the bedroom door opening and an unnaturally tall, very thin, black shadowy figure entered the room and floated over to where my old bed was. And then it was completely pitch black. I couldn't see anything at all and still couldn't move, but I felt an evil presence standing right next to the bed and it called my name and said, "Let's go." And then I felt something grab my left arm next to the edge of my bed and try to drag me off the bed. I still couldn't recall language, so I couldn't pray or call for help, but I could feel terror and extreme fear and also extreme resistance to being dragged anywhere. It felt like I was being dragged in a place for a minute, but it did eventually stop and I went right back to sleep. I never got out of paralysis in the first experience, and when I woke up in the morning I remembered everything and thought it was a really unusual nightmare. And right then I rolled over and saw the bedroom door open and ajar and the lights were on in the kitchen and living room. Now this was very unusual as I always turn off my lights and close the doors before I go to sleep, and tonight was no exception. I slept in the student community room for a few nights after that because I didn't feel safe sleeping in the apartment. I did the night shift at a gas station because I was strapped for cash and needed a second job. I worked the night shift there for a few months, and it was around my second or third month that this guy started coming in really late at night, always around 2 a.m. He was about 6 feet tall and he had long stringy hair. He'd always come in, buy alcohol and leave right after. But then one night he asked me my name. I told him my name and he just kept saying Rob for some reason. He then opened the bottle he just bought and walked out of the store talking to himself. This was the night I was curious to see if he had been drinking and driving every single time that he'd come to the store. I watched as he left and he walked out of sight of the gas station property. It would make sense, however, because he never bought gas anytime he came in and he'd always just buy alcohol. I'd seen him just about every night after that, and for a while he'd come in, some nights noticeably drunker than others, and sometimes he'd just lean on one of the shelves for a while and not say anything. He'd always greet me with a hay rod anytime he'd come in, and one night he was just leaning on a shelf drinking the alcohol all by himself, not saying anything and just staring at the wall. I asked him for his name finally, and he looked at me, took about 5 seconds and said Bob. I always felt like Bob is a go-to fake name when you're lying about your name. I wondered if the first thing that came to mind for him was Bob, because it also rhymes with my name, but I went with it and I said, "Where do you work at?" He said he doesn't work, and he said the government completely effed him out of his job. I got the vibe he was wasted again, and he looked at me with an angry-looking face. But then he said, "I like you, Rob. You seem like a guy who knows what he's doing." I didn't know what that meant, but he walked out of the store right after that, and I didn't see him again for a while. I'd say over a week passed, which for a regular like Bob was quite a while. Bob always gave me off this mildly creepy vibe. I figured he was usually drunk, but something was obviously wrong in his personal life. Well, one very stormy night with less customers than usual, likely because of the storm, I heard the ding of the front door as someone entered. And I swear, before looking, I imagined it to be Bob, and when I looked, I was shocked to see it was actually him. It was a much scarier version of Bob, as he was completely soaked and he wasn't wearing a rain jacket or using an umbrella. He was just in a dark shirt and jeans. His long hair was drenched and he was just standing by the door looking straight ahead at the wall. He looked like he was angry and yet his mind was elsewhere. I said, "Bob, are you okay?" He didn't turn his head or move. Instead, he stood still and said, "I did something really bad." I then asked him, "What did you do?" And he then looked at me and he said he needed somewhere to hide, and then walked past me at the register towards the little restroom hallway. He disappeared behind the wall and I heard one of the doors open and close. I was generally getting creeped out by Bob now, and I didn't enjoy his presence whenever he was in the store, and tonight something was extra off about him. Some time passed and Bob never came out of the bathroom. I assumed he was wasted again, probably passed out or puking. Either way, I didn't want to intervene, and then the next thing I remember, the lights to the place cut out and the store was completely dark. I was standing in a pitch-dark gas station during a major storm with an unhinged drunk man. I used a flashlight from behind the counter to make my way towards the back of the store by the inventory storage. The door to the back was in the same little hallway as the restrooms. As I walked by the two restrooms doors, both of them were ajar and Bob wasn't in either one of them. I went through the door to the back and I was planning on going straight to the panel board, but I stopped when I heard a slight dripping in the room somewhere and the squeaking of wet shoes. My heart sank into my stomach and I said "Bob" in a very weak and scared voice. I heard squeaks right to my left, and when I pointed my flashlight in that corner, that was Bob, with his eyes opened wide, and he lunged at me and started screaming, "I'm going to kill you." I pushed him off me as hard as I could, and as he was clawing at my back, I started running back through the door to the front of the store. He didn't follow me, and I grabbed my rain jacket and ran straight to my car. As I sat in my car, I dialed 911 and spoke to an operator. I stayed on the line with her, and it didn't take long for a couple of officers to arrive and go inside. Bob was still hiding in the back room, huddled in a corner. Eventually, they took him to the station, and I told the officers that he lunged at me and tried to kill me, and stated that he did something really bad. Around a few months later, I found out that Bob's real name was Martin, and he had beaten his ex-wife to death. It honestly might have happened on the same night that he came into the gas station. Long story short, I never wanted to work another night shift again. For a bit of context, I work at a gas station in the backwoods of Tennessee, and that's where this happened. Last night, when I clocked in at 8, the store was completely dead. I figured it was going to be a pretty easy night because the road this station is on is not connected to the main road. Actually, it used to be up until about a decade ago when a new freeway was built. This led basically every business that was there to pack up and leave their old building abandoned. Well, thanks to this, there are a lot of abandoned buildings on this stretch of road that local druggies tend to claim as their own. Anyways, at around 11, I only had an hour left of my shift, and so I figured I should actually get some work done instead of just sitting around and doing nothing. I'm 18, and so I work the shift alone, which is nice because it means I can do pretty much whatever I want. I noticed we were almost out of barbecue chips, and so I needed to go get them from our storage space, which is for some reason in the basement of the station. I've always hated going down there just because it gives me the creeps, and why the owner decided to store everything down there is beyond my comprehension. I got about halfway down the steps before something fell on the other side of the room, and it sounded like footsteps were coming my way. I sprinted up the stairs and locked the door to the basement, panicking like a madman the entire time. When I got back upstairs, I went behind the counter to the store computer so I could check the cameras. I flicked over to the one that looks into the basement, and there was this guy just standing there smiling up onto the camera. He had a look of absolute insanity in his eyes, but he didn't look like the average junkie in the area. He was clean shaven and dressed in what looked like to be jeans and a bottom up of some kind. Honestly, if he'd walked into the store, I wouldn't have batted an eye, but because he was down there and he was just looking into the camera, smiling, it shook me to my core. I called the store owner, and at first he was pretty mad since I called him in the middle of the night, but once he heard how freaked out I was, his tone changed. He told me he'd be there in 15 minutes and to just lock the main door to the store and make sure the man didn't go anywhere. I asked him if I should call the police, but for some reason he didn't want me to do that just yet. I locked the entrance to the gas station and went back to looking at the man. He was still there, just smiling up at me. About 3 or so minutes of him staring at me later, and he walked out of view of the camera. My boss showed up soon after armed with a shotgun, and when I let him in, he right away went to the basement. I went with him just because I felt safe with him. We ended up not finding anything, and my boss ultimately chalked this up to me being tired and hallucinating the man. But I know what I saw, and this has me scared shitless as I clock back into work in a few hours, and I'm really dreading it. It was a cold winter evening, and it was about 8:30 p.m., and one of my friends had invited me and some of our other friends to a sleepover. So I ended up asking my mom, and she said yes, I could go. I quickly put some clothes and a pillow into my backpack, and I went to the door and told my mom I was going. Seeing as where I lived everyone was nice and there was never any crime, my mom let me walk to my friend's house. She only lived about 10 minutes away from me, and I thought the fresh air would do me some good, seeing as I have been in the house all week. I said my goodbyes to my mom and my little sister before leaving the house and walking down the street. About 5 minutes into my walk, I came across a graveyard that led into some woods that then opened up to some housing where my friend lived. I then started walking through the graveyard, but as I was walking, I saw something in the corner of my eye. It was a woman. She was just standing by an old gravestone looking down, but that's not what got my attention. It was her skin. It was all ripped and scratched and looked like it was rotting away. Her clothes were muddy and ripped, and not only that, but they looked quite old. As I kept walking, the woman turned to look at me, and when she did, I was absolutely shocked. She had no eyes, and her face had cuts on it, and her hair looked like it was falling out. As I looked at her in shock, she started to walk over to me slowly. It looked like she was dragging one of her legs, but I didn't stay to find out. I acted quickly and ran to the woods, looking back every so often to see her still following me. I kept running, but while looking back, I noticed she was catching up to me. I panicked as I was running, and I tripped over a rock that was sticking out of the ground. I hit my head on the ground, knocking myself out for about a minute or more. As I opened my eyes, the woman was stood looking down at me with her empty eyes, making my blood run cold. I looked back at her, and she brought one of her hands to my head, making me flinch. Her hand was as cold as ice, and I looked at her, and she looked harmless in a way, but I looked so terrified at the same time. As I looked at her, I spoke shakily. "Who are you?" When I asked this, the woman tilted her head and removed her hand, and before I knew it, everything cut to black all of a sudden. Before everything cleared up, I was in a ditch, but this ditch was about 6 feet deep, and I quickly went to stand up, but I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed. I started to panic even more, and when I looked up, I saw the woman looking down at me in the ditch. Before I felt mud being thrown down onto me, I tried to scream, but nothing came out, and after a few minutes, I was covered in mud. Everything was dark once again, and I couldn't breathe. Everything was silent before I heard a voice whisper, "They killed me." After that, I opened my eyes and screamed. I was back in the woods, but the woman was gone, and I took that as my chance to run, so I picked up my bag and ran to my friend's house. I didn't tell them what had happened to me that night, but Still to this day, whenever I pass that graveyard, I still see her standing there looking at that old grave before looking at me and disappearing. I've experienced paranormal activity while at cemeteries. I take ghost photos, and those that say cemeteries aren't ever haunted are mistaken. If you want to catch ghost photos in a cemetery, just look for one that is very deserted, quiet, and even peaceful. Wait until it's either almost dark or just as the sun begins to rise. If you see one with running water nearby, it's even better. Remember to always be respectful of the dead no matter where you go. The cemetery is no different. I don't trespass. If there are signs stating the cemetery closes at dark, that's my deadline. We can all thank the little jerks that think it's funny to destroy grave markers. I usually get my best shots when I take my time, speak to the spirits, and let them know why I am there. When I am done, I thank them for their time. I also let them know that they cannot go home with me. I will attach a photo for you, but I have many. When I was about 16, my friend Sean, who was a big goofball, came over to chill in our basement as he often would during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand and I was eating Wendy's when he said we should check out that creepy cemetery across the town. Still, we had no school the next day and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if one should even call that a regular cemetery. It was a large plot of land with maybe 1,000 tombstones at most. The tombstone was very archaic looking, and anytime we passed, there were no signs of anyone having come to visit within the last 2 decades. It was very old and it had been closed 10 years ago. The site dated back centuries and it had this super creepy vibe to it because it was closed off by a gothic metal fence. It was also surrounded by woods on 2 sides and some old abandoned buildings was at the center of it. Everything about it just gave scary vibes. Many people had reported weird sightings and strange sounds coming from the graves. Almost everyone in town had their own personal story of the place. Some of them were obviously exaggerated. 2 of the best stories I've heard from my family were from my uncle and my grandma. My uncle had once heard someone screaming for help while he was driving near that place. He stopped, got out of his car, and heard the scream again. He said it was coming from inside one of the graves near the wire, and he quickly left. My grandma had once seen a lady dressed in white clothes slowly waving her hand at her. We had also heard many rumors about that place, like some people would go there at 3 a.m. to perform satanic rituals and other weird stuff. Some people had reported seeing smoke rising from deep within the cemetery at midnight. It took a little persuading, but Sean managed to get me to want to check it out too, and I always wanted to visit that place after hearing so many creepy stories, but was too scared to even attempt it. I previously never had any paranormal experiences in my life and always wanted to see something crazy. We woke up the next day at 4 a.m. and left at 4:30 before anyone figured out what we were up to. Sean pulled up his Honda to the side of the road and I told him to pull it up more so it wasn't obvious. This was a low traffic road so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few hundred feet down the road and we got out and cut through the woods so that any potential passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the huge cemetery. The forest was full of fog and it looked like a scene from a horror movie. I started having second thoughts, but we had already made it this far. Hoping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Sean kind of took the lead on this since it was mainly his venture. We finally reached the cemetery and the place was looking as creepy as ever because of the fog. We couldn't see that far away and he led me through the eerie plot of land and we looked at the archaic tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century and the writing on some of them was illegible at that point. I knew it sounds super cliche, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched constantly. I started looking around the surrounding trees and I kept getting scared by trees. They looked like people in the fog and my mind was playing tricks on me. I was prepared for a jump scare. I told Sean how creepy this was and he replied with "I know." We kept walking deeper into the cemetery and we hadn't seen anything weird. My fear started to go away. Maybe this was just another quiet, depressing place, I thought. We walked further and we could see an outline of a huge abandoned building. We had reached the center of the cemetery and as soon as I realized this, I started getting a bad feeling. My chest felt heavy and fear filled my body for no apparent reason, but we kept moving. Sean wanted to look inside the building and then leave. The closer we got to the building, the more sick I felt. I almost felt like passing out and I told him to go alone and make it quick. I sat next to the grave to catch my breath and he continued forward, leaving me alone. It had been a few minutes since he went inside and I was starting to feel better and thought about following him inside. I hadn't even fully gotten up when I saw a person walking just 6 graves away. I froze for a moment and quickly hid behind a tombstone. I slowly peeked at him and he was definitely not Sean. He was a lot taller, wearing a hooded black cloak, and he looked like he was in his 50s. He walked towards a grave and stopped at its foot, just a few feet away from where I was, and he had his back turned towards me. He was speaking, but I couldn't understand. It was another language, a weird one. Like he was speaking in English but backwards. It sounded extremely creepy. Who was this guy? Maybe one of the people who was involved in one of the satanic rituals. But what he did next scared the F out of me. He pulled a shovel out of nowhere and started digging into the grave while shouting in his weird language. I got scared and stopped peeking. I didn't know if this person would harm us or not, or if he knew we were here. Maybe he was armed. I got scared for Sean. He didn't know there was a lunatic out here. I wanted to leave this damn place like a flash, but I couldn't leave Sean alone. I stared desperately at the rotting building while the crazy screams got louder and weirder, like he was trying to summon something or cast a spell. I just thought he was mentally ill. Then I saw Sean sneak out of the building. He had heard the screams and he gestured to me to come towards him. We carefully met midway, hiding through the graves, and then, without saying a word to each other, ran like lunatics. The screams faded into the fog. We didn't say anything until we hopped the fence and got back into the car. Sean looked more scared than me, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. After a few seconds, he was finally able to tell me what he had seen. When Sean was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of freaky dolls with buttons for eyes. He saw rooms full of weird freakish dolls and other satanic symbols which were practically everywhere. He didn't get to see anything else in the building because he had heard the screams. We told the story to everyone and got scolded by our parents. Many people thought we were lying after a group of adults, after hearing our story, went to investigate the building and found it completely empty. I was shocked. Sean was never the same after he left the cemetery, and he no longer acted goofy or fearless. He was more serious and quiet now. I think Sean saw something in there, and something more than just dolls and satanic symbols. Something he still hasn't told me. I was walking around my neighborhood alone once, enjoying the night air and watching the stars. There was this little pond near my house with a wooded area that had trees, a bench, and a rope swing that went out over the water. I sat down on the bench to look at the stars, and I heard some rustling off to my right towards the trees. Bears were not uncommon where I'm from, so I took out my flashlight and shone it around over there. I didn't see anything, and it freaked me out, to be honest, so I kept my flashlight on and my senses aware. I did stay on the bench, however, to mull over my thoughts and watch the sky some more. Anyways, a few minutes passed and I heard nothing more, so I leaned back into the bench and started to relax a bit more. I'm staring up at the sky with my flashlight pointed downwards so as not to create any light pollution. That's when I noticed something in the tree in my peripheral vision. I couldn't tell what it was, but the branch was swaying slightly and the rustling noise was back too. I immediately sat up and stared at it, but I hadn't shown my flashlight at it yet in case of pissing off some huge bird or something else. I don't think I've ever been that scared, and I remember my heart was beating so fast and I could taste blood. I stared at it for what seemed like forever and it slowly stopped moving, but the shape was still there. Bears do not climb trees sometimes, so I was hesitant to run away in case that's what it was, so I just kept staring at it. After some time, I had built up my courage to shine my light at the tree. It was a man, an effing man in the tree, crouched in the tree like some naked monkey. He had no expression on his face, but his eyes were open really wide, and when my light landed on him, he started to move like he was going to come down. I didn't stick around to see if he did and started running for the hills. I ran to my house and around to the back door and locked myself in without looking back once. I went around and made sure every window and door was locked. I even checked the attic. I never go out alone anymore. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was not a night person at all and went to sleep rather quickly. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite, but all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was on a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police patrolled park quite a few ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment, and that's when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street on my side was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. I decided he was most likely drunk, and I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and he was even wearing an old suit. He danced even closer until I could make out his face. His eyes were open very wide. His head was tilted back slightly, and therefore he was looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully white cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street, and as I reached the other side, I glanced back and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me but still looking skyward, the smile still wide on his lips. I was completely unnerved by this, and I started walking again but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move, and once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were also completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear he had moved fast. I was so shocked I stood there for some time staring at him, and then he started moving towards me. He took giant exaggerated tiptoed steps as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen as the smiling man crept towards me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind, and what I meant to ask was, "What the F do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone, but what came out was a whimper. Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me feel more afraid. He didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. Then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance walking away. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight, and then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile again, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk again. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk, and he also didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane, and that's a very, very scary thing to see. This all happened on a cold winter night around the time of Halloween. Me and my friend, who I won't say their name, were going to a haunted house in our area. It was crazy because we never actually went inside of a haunted house, and it was always usually the normal trick-or-treating, and we were both 11 at the time. So we were walking to the haunted house, and when we had finally arrived, it was creepy as hell. It looked very realistic, and I knew that these people spent a lot of time making it. It was a maze-like haunted house, and you had to find your way out in darkness. When we were inside, my friend decided that she wouldn't go ahead in first and that I would have to lead the way. I felt annoyed, but it was fine. It was very dark and I couldn't see well. A fake Michael Myers looking guy scared the F out of me, and then there was a basement, which I sadly didn't know about as I tumbled down the stairs. They never told you how to get out, so I assumed you'd have to find a door, and my friend saw a door which seemed to be a way out. She opened it and I followed right after her. It wasn't that good of a discovery though, as we saw some dark red in the door which had a light on. We both ran out of there ASAP, and I legit was scared of being in there now. I then saw another guy who said he found the way out, and me and my friend both went out and thanked the guy nicely. We then started walking home, and honestly we were still kind of disturbed, but still somewhat relieved that we got out. We then saw a guy pull up saying he had candy in his car. I was very stupid back then, and I decided to follow while my friend went along too. When we made it to his car, he opened the trunk of it and had a lot of candy in there. I was so happy and wanted as much as possible, and he then said, "I have a lot more at my house, you two want to go?" We were total nincompoops and went around by the side door when my friend spotted about 4 other men inside of the car, some with creepy looking smiles, and they were the creepiest looking guys I ever saw. Yellow teeth, most with balding black or brown hair, a bald guy with a tattoo on his neck, and my friend got scared shitless and ran away. I started following her, and the car followed behind us. The car decided to go slowly, but make sure it could see us. I assumed not to look suspicious. I then decided to run into the woods to hide because we were in a dead-end street at that point. My friend went to hide behind some bushes, and I came up with an idea, and I'll forever thank the game hide and seek for this. I told my friend to come next to me and I let her down under a bunch of branches. It was different because these branches surrounded the area and they were dipped down from a small hill on a rockyish surface, almost like a small cave. I then grabbed other branches to surround us completely to the point where we would be nearly, if not even impossible to see. We both heard footsteps and held our breath. We then saw feet right next to us but go down the hill. We even heard other footsteps go further and further. When we couldn't hear them anymore, we both removed the branches as quickly as we could and sprinted to my house. We called the police but couldn't do much since we didn't get the license plate, so we kinda just dropped the whole thing and moved on. At one time, I didn't believe ghosts exist, and I used to mock the statement while others embraced it. I don't believe in anything unless my eyes lay on whatever I'm looking at, and at first, if someone told me anything about a ghost, I would probably make fun of them. Anyway, it all started on a cold winter night, and the wind outside was howling, and the trees were scraping against my window with a nasty chalkboard scrape sound. I was inside reading a novel while listening for the doorbell to ring. My friend Quincy was coming over and we were going over to the old mansion up on Devil's Peak. Devil's Peak was supposed to be the scariest and creepiest place anybody could possibly be, or at least that's what I'm told. I was heading to my refrigerator when suddenly a loud crash came from outside. I don't know what it was, but going to the door sent a shiver straight down my spine. I slowly reached for the doorknob when suddenly unbelievable pounding hit the front door and I fell backwards, landing on my back. The door came flying wide open and to my surprise it was Quincy. It seems he tripped and knocked over my plant, causing it to hit the ground and make the crashing sound. Quincy came barging in, telling me on his way here he heard noises coming from the old mansion on Devil's Peak, and before I replied to him, I lifted myself up and took a breather. I told him that's impossible since no one has lived there for years, but he insisted that it was true. At first I thought about it and then replied to him in a clear statement. Let's go take a look at that mansion then. Having to walk up the hill to Devil's Peak took a lot of energy only because the hill was huge and steep. As we got closer to the mansion, I started wondering if Quincy was telling the truth or lying to scare me. Either way, I would get to the bottom of whatever this so-called noise was. We finally reached the top of the hill, and to my surprise, the mansion was bigger than I expected. It was blue with white and had a white double door crafted out of marble and wooded windows perfectly spread a good 5 feet away from each other. The curtains looked as if they were dusted only 5 minutes before we arrived. The house looked as if it had never been touched, and walking up to the front door, I realized Quincy was still at the top of the hill staring at the mansion. I grabbed him and told him there was nothing to be scared of, and soon afterwards we heard some kind of thunder. I'll be honest, we both jumped and screamed, and then out of nowhere we fell on our butts. As we got up and cleaned ourselves off, it started raining, so I advised we go into the mansion until the weather cleared up, and so we did. Walking into the mansion felt comforting and yet disturbing. I noticed there was some polished furniture in what seemed to be the living room. I told Quincy I was going to check it out, and he told me not to wander off because there might be some ghosts. I told him not to worry and that there were no such thing as ghosts, and as soon as I turned around, I smacked my head dead on with a piece of wood hanging from the ceiling. I waited for the pain to go away and then ventured into the living room. When I entered the living room, something didn't feel right, nor did it feel bad, but something caught my eye before I thought about these feelings. It was a record player, but it didn't have the usual needle you put on the record. Instead, it had a big tuba-looking thing above it. Quincy then came into the room a few minutes later, looking around, and also observed the weird record player. I told him the sound probably came out from the top, and my eyes while scanning the record player caught a circular shape in a distance hanging off the side of the table. I started walking over to it and grabbed it. Picking up the object, I could tell it was a good 50 years old, or even more. Plus, to my surprise, it was a record. The names and songs on the records were scratched and faded, so I couldn't tell what kind of music it was. But as I was dying to try it out, Quincy urged me to put it down because the record was delicate and could break and cut me any time. I told him not to worry as I set up the record on the record player and listened in horror. Quincy and I both gazed at the record player. The record did not play a song, but in its place a recording of someone's dark, deep voice. The voice sounded depressed, and by deepness of the voice it sounded male. Anyway, the voice spoke, and not to itself, but I think us. The voice was telling us that we were now trapped and that the way to get out was to live through the 3 events that happened in the past. Not only see the events, but also feel them. I shut my mouth after the voice stopped talking and thought to myself, I did not just hear a voice from 50 years ago talk to me. While I was troubling with the fact that a voice talked to us, Quincy threw himself at the door, and to our astonishment, it was boarded up. My mouth went wide and I was speechless. We were locked inside by whatever forces kept us here, and then we heard something. I completely lost all thought of anything at the moment, and I'm guessing so did Quincy. What we heard next was phenomenal. It was a lady talking, and then out of nowhere, a loud scream came from all directions and shattered the windows above us by the stairwell. And then I came up with an idea. Whoever is messing with us forgot one important thing: locking the windows, or better yet, making them soundproof. I grabbed Quincy and we started running to the windows. We then jumped out of the window and fell onto the ground. We then started running as fast as we could, not even looking back. Even while running, we heard all kind of noises from the house. Once we got home, we both started locking the doors. Ever since then, I have started believing in the paranormal. And to be quite honest, I still have some restless nights because of it.